So Matthew, I want to start by going back to the mid-1990s, if you like, the moment where New Labour is beginning to form its ideas, its programme for government. And I want to ask you if you can sort of characterise, if you like, the approach to the welfare state and pensions as well in that period.
Yeah, so I think to understand where New Labour is in terms of its kind of positioning and policy, there are various elements that you have to bear in mind. So there's a kind of legacy element. So Blair inherits some policy that he's able to ditch quite quickly. So I think within a few days of becoming leader, for example, he distances himself from Labour's education policies, which were kind of progressive, trade union endorsed, into a more kind of traditionalist, standards-based agenda. But there are other areas where it's not so easy to do that, even if he had wanted to. The minimum wage being, a good example, Scottish devolution being another example, the implementation of the European Social Chapter being another. So I think even were the focus groups to have been saying these policies were problematic and dangerous, they were bred in the bone by then. They were not going to be abandoned. And I think, to be fair to Tony, I don't think that he was hostile to them anyway. So there's a certain kind of legacy. Then you've got the kind of thinking that IPPR have been doing around that time, and the Smith Commission on Social Justice, and this kind of, as you say, you talk about the social investment state, or there's that kind of the rhetoric of, I think in the report, the phrase, fewer ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, more fences at the top of the cliff. So that kind of shift from post hoc redistribution to investment to skills, preparing people to be able to thrive in the modern labour market. Borrowing there to a certain extent on European practice as well. And then you have to bring into that other kind of elements of this. So one element is the desire to be seen to be holding firm on some left shibboleths, which the New Labour project was about saying, no, we're not going to commit to that. And of course, one of those was the restoring of the link between pensions and earnings inflation. And there was a kind of set-piece argument with Barbara Castle. I remember having to look after Barbara Castle at a party conference, and she was kind of given the special status of being able to criticise Tony in New Labour because she was, the figure that she was. And in a sense, it was that we can, we're big enough to be able to deal with Barbara Castle. But Labour resisted that, and the resistance to that earnings link was connected to, of course, the deeper story around fiscal rectitude and not raising taxes. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the legacy. On the other hand, you've got the kind of political positioning about distancing itself from left positions which appeared to suggest that Labour lacked fiscal discipline, and the earnings link was a kind of totem of that. And then you've got, as I say, the third element, which is this different thinking and new thinking, which I don't think my sense was not really fully developed, actually. But I wasn't deeply involved in policy making up to 97. I was on the kind of campaign side and the kind of side of the campaigning and messaging. So what was going on in terms of the deep thinking that people like David Miliband was doing, I couldn't claim to be kind of party to that. And I can't remember what was in the 97 manifesto. So I'm looking at this from the kind of political positioning. And these are the three: the legacy, the New Labour bit, and the kind of more intellectually grounded piece about moving from kind of post hoc to investment.
I suppose an implication of that, the New Labour electoral coalition could afford not to offer something like the restoration of the earnings link to an older population, or a population approaching retirement, and instead had to prioritise this kind of more cross-class coalition of working age that wanted schools, the NHS, skills and so on to be the priority.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think that, and maybe I'm being misty-eyed about it, but I also think that New Labour on the whole eschewed the kind of retail politics that has kind of grown ever since, really. I think that we didn't have an account which was, in fact, we explicitly, I think, rejected the idea that you had a policy that bought off different groups. The view was, and this kind of goes back to Philip Gould, the view was that the problem for Labour was a deeper problem of identity and connection. And that was the core to the strategy. And in fact, the view was that Labour in the past had, it had come out of the 92 election and then found that its brand was still highly problematic with people. You remember Philip Gould saying, it's not just that people felt that voting Labour was something for people that people did on the way down. They almost had this kind of mystical sense that if you voted Labour, you were more likely to end up being the kind of person on the way down. So that was the core to it. And I think there was a sense that part of the reason that Labour was seen as being not credible for government, being risky, was because of a sense that Labour had that kind of attitude of trying to buy off various constituencies by making public spending promises. So in a sense, that conversation, which is, in my recollection, is that there isn't, if you had said in kind of New Labour circles, well, what about a policy, this policy that will work with these people and these people, they would have said, and that's not the right way to think about it. That's the old way of thinking about it. We have to have a kind of a discourse that appeals to everybody, and we have to resist that kind of buying off approach, because once you start down that, and that's really to do with Gordon and to do with the strategy on public spending.
And that strategy on public spending that's the primary driver of the reliance on means testing to create a pension credit, a minimum income guarantee, rather than to restore the earnings link. Is that the main driver of the policy that Labour takes in the government?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that during the 97 election campaign, one of the only moments in that campaign, I was in Millbank Tower, of worry was when John Major unveiled a very ambitious pension reform package. And maybe because we were just jittery anyway, because of what happened in the past in elections, there was a couple of hours when we thought, this seems very, very bold. I mean, I can't remember what he argued for, but and there was a sense that might be powerful, partly because Labour's position had not been to have highly elaborated policies to deal with specific issues. And there's a kind of sense, well, has he onto something here? That he's presenting something that's quite sophisticated, quite well thought through, quite kind of, courageous. Of course, it didn't make a jot of difference and it had disappeared by the evening news, but there was a little frisson. And I remember people in Melbourne going, oh, it's quite a good policy, this, But anyway, it didn't last.
So you then go from the Labour Party to go and run IPPR. IPPR had published the Commission on Social Justice, which had advocated, as you say, for a more investment approach and for means testing to deal with pensioner poverty. IPPR then starts doing work which starts to change those kinds of assumptions, in many ways prefiguring what Turner would eventually come to say. Can you say a little bit about how you did that work and how you arrived at those conclusions?
Yeah, and actually, whilst my recollection of events and people is never been great, I can actually remember this incredibly specifically, which was that we set out on the looking at the pensions issue more broadly, and the problems that we had of affordability and of savings rates and of fairness, and as was my wont, I was kind of flitting around doing 101 things, didn't take particular interest in the research, and I remember Sue Regan coming into my office with Peter Robinson, who were the people working on the project. And I remember, I can't remember if it was both of them or just Sue, I reckon it was just Sue, but coming into my office and saying, look, we need to talk to you. I'm saying, okay, fine. And them saying, look, I know this is difficult for you because of your kind of political positioning and our political positioning at IPPR, but actually we've come to the conclusion that we do need to, part of the package is that we do need to restore the earnings thing. And I remember saying, great, well, fine. That's fine, But it was an interesting moment because it certainly wasn't where we started from, but that was where they got to.
Those ideas were then sort of starting to form, if you like, in what was then the most important centre-left think tank that was doing the sort of thinking that was close to...
Yeah, and unlike my account of New Labour, which is a highly political account, this is conscientious, number crunchers and policy analysts looking at something and saying, oh, it looks like that kind of slightly old-fashioned idea that doesn't really fit with the time. Actually, that's right. So I mean, good luck to them. I mean, I don't know. I can't. Had I been doing the project, would I have, if the figures started to demonstrate this was the right policy, would I have tried to stop it? I don't think I would. But certainly, I was completely happy with. That's the role of think tanks to say surprising things. Yeah. And it wasn't the only one, by the way. I mean, I think at that stage, one of the reasons IPPR was doing so well was in a number of areas, public-private partnerships, student finance. We were doing work which A, went ahead of where the government was, and B, was ideologically interesting because it was difficult to kind of pigeonhole it, and it annoyed a lot of people, but for different kind of reasons.
Can you remember the dissemination of that work then, and talking to people in Number 10 at the time, or talking to the trade unions?
I can't remember much, actually. The only thing I specifically remember was I was really, really annoyed with Nick Timmins because who's a friend of mine now, but I thought it was a really big story, and I was obsessed, as you remember, Nick, with media coverage. I thought it was a huge story, and he broke the embargo and released it the day early, and so we didn't get any coverage for it. The connection between the work we did and then what Adair did and how policy eventually went, I think that's slightly underestimated for the simple, kind of slightly, trivial but actually quite important reason, which is that it was rather than being splashed on the front pages as the Commission for Public-Private Partnerships was, it didn't get any coverage because it was a little column in the Financial Times and everyone said the next day, oh, it's been covered.
Can you just say a little bit about where pensions reform kind of ranked for the Prime Minister and for his key advisor like yourself?
It wasn't, I don't think, when I arrived, kind of entered 2003, moving 2004, it wasn't seen as being a political priority because it didn't kind of fit with Tony's worldview, which was that he was kind of arch moderniser, willing to kind of confront the issues that needed to be confronted. Pensions didn't quite have that kind of frisson at that stage. It was a slightly, Adair and his team were going off and doing work, but it didn't feel like it was something that was terribly salient to the core politics of the time. But it became so. And it became so, I think, really for three reasons, probably. I think, firstly, it became so because it started to become clear that Adair had a big plan. This wasn't going to be one of those processes that generates, only kind of marginal or totally unrealistic policies. So I think there was a kind of growing interest in the fact that Adair seemed to be doing work that was radical and robust. I think, secondly, as Tony approached the third term, knowing that his time was limited, he wanted to achieve some things, and pensions moved on to that list, along with kind of public service reform and antisocial behaviour, the things that. So it started to be something he wanted to do because it got connected to the legacy conversation. And then thirdly, it became a Blair Brown issue. And in becoming a Blair Brown issue, the determination of us in Number 10 to fight, knowing that Gordon was going to stand in the way of reform. And it became bloody. If those three things hadn't happened, it may have been continued to be in the kind of too difficult to solve tray. But I think the combination of Adair, legacy, and the unwillingness to let Gordon Brown stop us running the country were the things that kind of gave it a lot more kind of viscerality, really.
Just on Turner's work itself, how far was that piece of policy work? Very, very convincing, grounded in a lot of evidence. It was just much harder for people who wanted to oppose it to do so.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think Adair was just an incredibly credible figure, and the rest of the Commission were very credible figures as well. And I think that they kept the key institutions in the loop, so they didn't, commit the error of creating powerful enemies early on. But I think as important and possibly more important than the quality of the work was Adair's communication skills and his willingness and his success in establishing the premise of the work early on. And I think critical to that was establishing the fact that pension entitlement age was going to have to go up. And he established that pretty early on. And that, I think, I've always thought that was the thing that could have held it below the waterline. Had he not managed that well, and had the Daily Mail or whoever, Daily Mirror could have been, kind of caught wind of this and decided to put a kind of work till you drop front page, that might have been enough. That happens in a bad news week. It's not, at this stage, a kind of mission-critical reform. It's easy to see how it would have been, well, we're very interested in this commission, but, we've got other things to do. But he successfully drove home the fact that one of the hardest parts of his package, which was, getting pension slightly older, because that was, in a sense, the most difficult idea of all, actually. And because he drove that home very early on, partly because of the quality of the data, and because it's just an intuitively kind of compelling argument. I mean, there is a big argument against it in terms of social justice and life expectancies, of course. But when we talk later about the review I did for the government, I learned that was a big kind of lesson for me as well, which is establish the core elements of legitimacy early on in the process.
So in his first report setting out, this is the context, these are the trends, if you carry on as you are, your policy will end up.
Look, I mean, there are three core policy narratives. There's Fork in the Road, there's Brave New Future, and there's Burning Platform. And, he did Burning Platform. I think pretty early on, very few people said, why do we have to do any of this?
Can you just say a little bit about the politics within the Labour movement of this?
Yeah, no, I can't pretend to have been involved in that a great deal. I think Adair, again, did a lot of that work. And again, that's another lesson, which is, you do a piece of work like this for the government, you have to do your own stakeholder engagement. You can't rely on the government to do it for you. My only real sense was that the hardcore opponents were always the insurance industry. They were the ones who were the most implacable opponents. They were the ones that you had to kind of, who were pretty ruthless in terms of their willingness to take it. But my sense was that Adair really occupied a pretty broad progressive space, and most people wanted him to succeed. And that included the kind of trade unions who were at that stage, I think, I don't know, it's interesting about trade unions. Every time you look at today's trade unionists, you think that the last generation of trade unionists were titans in comparison. But my sense was that the trade unions were taking a reasonably pragmatic view. They didn't see any kind of political upside in opposing this. What's happening in the third term is that the position of Gordon and the Eds is that Tony has no legitimacy and that he must be stopped from doing anything. And they're explicit about this. So Gordon wants to stop any decisions being made. He also wants to stop anything that involves spending any money because he wants to have money to spend himself. And so he really tries to undermine Turner at every turn, and we entered into this kind of bizarre position of the Treasury. So Adair produces his figures and demonstrates the affordability of his package. Treasury officials are then told to produce a rebuttal of this, saying that the figures don't add up. Gordon comes to meetings with Tony with kind of handwritten notes saying, no, we've looked at this and it doesn't add up and it's all nonsense. Tony's advisors say, well, this is just ridiculous. This is kind of groundless. Actually, it is very robust, and it becomes very poisonous. And it culminates in a particular moment for me, which is worth describing because it just captures what went on. And this is really important because I think you're going to interview Gordon. I'd be interested to see what he says. But Gordon's view may be, well, I didn't want Tony to do it, but I was going to do it myself anyway, which is pretty bloody perverse, to be honest. But he did try and sabotage it. And there's a particular moment in this process. And what happened was that Adair wrote to Number 10, and I think to Gordon as well, in the middle of this, and said, look, I've just read the latest Treasury rebuttal of my figures. It's absolute nonsense. let me reiterate again that everything we've done is robust and these are the figures and it is affordable and there it is. And kind of objecting really. And kind of, I think, also saying, look, we've tried to engage the Treasury in this process and they haven't engaged in a realistic and grown-up way. They just occasionally produce these kind of random rebuttals. Anyway, this letter got into the public domain. And I was, I think it's a Saturday, so I'm shopping or something. And I get a phone call from the press office that says that Tony has just been interviewed. He was in Scotland, I think, been interviewed by Adam Bolton. And Adam Bolton said to Tony, we understand this letter from Adair Turner criticising Gordon Brown has been leaked by Number 10. And indeed, we've been told that it's been leaked by Matthew Taylor. So Tony is asked on air whether it's true that I have leaked this letter. To which, good for him, he says no, absolutely not. So I then say to make it clear that I am going to go into work on Monday and I'm going to seek legal redress for the fact that I've been accused of a, what would be basically a sackable offence. So the next day I get a phone call from Sue Nye who says that Gordon wants to speak to you. I'm standing in a kind of on Tooting Common in the wind watching my son play football. And Gordon comes on and he says, I understand you're very upset about that this has happened. I said, well, no, it's not really that this has happened, Gordon. You did it. Damien McBride, whoever it was, did it. You briefed that I committed a serious, sackable disciplinary offence. So what are you going to do about that? And you said, I don't, these things happen. I said, no, Gordon, it's not, these things don't happen. You did it. So what are you going to do about it? He said, So then we finished this conversation. I went to work on Monday morning and I said I made it clear, I think I spoke to Gus, and I said, I want you to represent me as your employee in acting against the Treasury for the fact that they have basically slandered me. And so this kind of conversation goes on, and it's pointed out to me that if the government if there was any attempt to kind of sue the Treasury for what they'd said, of course the solicitors the government uses are the Treasury solicitors, so this would involve the Treasury suing itself. And I remember there was a moment that afternoon when Tony came into the office, my office, and said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm doing, what I'm doing is what I should do as somebody who was accused of an offence like this in public. I have no choice. I can't have it on the record that I leaked this letter. It's completely... So he said, well, okay. I thought it was all rather amusing. And then what happened was that on Newsnight that night, Michael Crick appeared on Newsnight. I wasn't watching it, but I was subsequently told. Appeared on Newsnight and said, I've been faxed this letter from Nick Macpherson. And what this letter seems to be is a Treasury apology for having, and now when I actually read the letter, it was, the suggestion that Matthew Taylor leaked this letter is clearly wrong. What it wasn't was, we did this, we're sorry. It was, we make it clear that we don't believe that Matthew Taylor did leak this letter. So I have to say, I've always felt a bit of triumph about this moment because, it was quite rare to get the Treasury to kind of half apologise. Anyway, but the reason I tell that story, it's partly because it just amuses me. But it tells you how, tense this was and how really the Treasury, the Gordon's people were willing to go quite a long way to try to stop these reforms going through because they didn't, on the one hand, they didn't want Tony to be getting the credit for anything, and on the other hand, they didn't want to commit to anything that might cost money. Can
you just say a little bit about how you approached this question of pensions, pension entitlement, security in older age for the self-employed and for gig economy workers more broadly?
Yeah, it's worth just putting in parentheses that I carried on doing pensions-related research work here, working with David Pitt-Watson, and we've been doing that for many years. And actually, this has reached culmination in the last few days when the government has passed the legislation on the Royal Mail and CDC. So we've we did an initial piece of work here, which was around charges, hidden fees and charges in relation to private pensions. And that has had an impact because actually fees have gone down a lot now. And then we started to make the case for CDC, and we've been working with the Royal Mail. And now what we're doing is working in government to say, look, let's create a framework for CDC more broadly, because all that's been agreed now is that the Royal Mail can do it. But we're interested in trying to extend that, and I think we're being listened to positively. So we'll see. So it's kind of odd for me because the pensions. I'm not a pensions policy wonk. My knowledge of pensions is very shallow, but I've ended up spending a lot of my life in IPPR and here working alongside people who've had a lot of impact. And that CDC thing is really is a great thing. So I just put that in parentheses. In terms of the work that I did for the government, I would say the significance is less the policy than the methodology that I used. So I borrowed from Adair. I have Adair as my model of how it is to have an impact with a review, and I combined my kind of own learning and what I knew about government, how government works, and kind of policy entrepreneurship with my sense of what Adair did and so that's why I think the review, in as much as it has been taken forward as being pretty successful, and I'm very happy to talk about that and how I went about that. In terms of the self-employed and pensions, it wasn't to be honest, it wasn't a huge issue because in a sense there were three levels to my report. The level which I was really asked to work on, and that was a relatively minor set of interventions that would do something to improve the clarity and protections of precarious workers and to address the problematic boundary between self-employment and worker status / employee status. And that's really a lot of the detail of my report is about that, and a lot of what's being carried forward is about that. The second level was a kind of broader reflection on some of the things which government should be really thinking about a bit more deeply in terms of the kind of medium term of the labour market. And that is where this self-employment stuff comes in a little bit. But I didn't really have a mandate to go in depth into that. My report was not about how to support the self-employed. And indeed, there was a parallel piece of work, and this piece of work published while I was working around kind of self-employment. So in a sense, if you were legitimately self-employed, that wasn't really part of my review. My review was about the borderline, yeah? But I did say some things about that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the highest level was the kind of concept of good work, which was a kind of attempt to kind of shift the Overton window to an extent, to kind of shift the nature of the debate and the kind of aspirations of public policy. So in that second piece, really all I did was to reflect a bit on where, if you were starting from scratch, what would be the system that you would devise, and my basic position there. And I didn't go I wasn't as bold as I could have been here, partly because I did focus on getting a report that was going to be agreed and not a report that was going to be killed because it was too controversial. So broadly there, what I'm doing is saying, look, what the government needs to think about is that in the medium term, if you were starting from scratch, you would probably have a system where you would not have massively different regime depending on people's employment status. You would have a common tax framework. You would tax labour as labour, regardless of the form of labour. And you would try to give a similar, as far as possible, similar level of protection to people, again, regardless of their employment form. So yes, so my general advocacy was the self-employed should probably be paying a little bit more tax. We who buy labour should be paying the same amount of tax for self-employed labour as we pay for employed labour. And the money that generates could be used to incentivise and support self-employed people in better protecting themselves. So that was the general thrust of my thinking. It is possible that thinking could have been more boldly expressed in my report and have been taken the form more of concrete recommendations rather than general reflections, had it not been, of course, for the Chancellor's catastrophic intervention in terms of his attempt to raise national insurance, which was just completely politically ham-fisted. I mean, of course, the policy was right, but it was ham-fisted. And because that kind of blew up, this whole area became an area which I had to kind of pull back from, because it was in danger of holding keeping the Treasury on board was a really important part of what I did in that review. And so they were happy for me to make the general recommendations about the direction of travel, but they wouldn't have been happy at all had I started making very concrete recommendations about increasing taxation in order to fund better protections. But that is, by the way, where I think we need to go. And I've never hidden that. I mean, whenever I've been asked that question on public platforms or in the media, I've always said, look, what we should go towards is a more uniform way of the very different ways in which we tax labour. And the fact that self-employed people have so little protection is a historical anomaly.
Thinking about the Turner recommendations, how much is it inevitable that as socioeconomic conditions change, new problems emerge, or there are limits to what any reform process can achieve, and there'll be unfinished business? And how much of this is unfinished business, or how much is it that, whilst it addressed some very big things, just didn't address enough of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Turner achieved an enormous amount, and I think it would be churlish to say that that Turner should have done more about, the self-employed, for example. I mean, yes, of course, in all areas. I mean, policy is never finished. There is always more to be done, because policy isn't perfect, and because the world continuously changes. The big shift, of course, was the fiscal environment. Turner could argue for things that cost money. And therefore he could argue for a framework in which more was asked of us to give our contributions, because it would be, matched, both by employers and supported by the government. Now, that's not the environment we're in. The environment you're in where businesses are squealing with pain, where there's, the context of austerity. Because, my view is that we should move towards a situation in which the default becomes for self-employed people that they save for a pension. But you cannot do that unless the government makes a contribution. Because actually the case for the self-employed to save for their pensions is not an open and shut case. There is a perfectly reasonable argument that there are different ways in which they should be trying to build up a flexible capital endowment. So I don't think you can shift to that default without providing an incentive, but an incentive is expensive. That's why it links round to a fairer tax system. That's a loop. The only way you can break into that loop is to spend a lot of money incentivizing self-employed saving, and there isn't a lot of money around. And because of what happened to the Chancellor, and because of the general kind of situation we're in, any recommendation that we increase taxes. Now, what of course is interesting is that the government is going about this through a different route. So it's IR35 is the way in which it is seeking to bear down on self-employment and sole trading because of the fiscal hole it's creating. But rather than doing it, as I would have advocated, as part of a kind of 10-year account of how it is you move to a more rational system, which is a kind of Turner-esque way of doing it, they can't do this because they don't have the political headspace to do it, and they don't have the money either.
I mean, the alternative, obviously, that the RSA has also advocated is to take your pensions tax relief system and convert it into a flat rate system, away from the current system of reliefs, and to use the resources generated by that to then do a better job for low-income workers and the self-employed. Presumably, you would also say that that's another route back into the sort of fiscal consolidation of a new pension.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the lesson from Turner is, and I don't see this happening anytime soon, but the lesson from Turner is we probably need another plan which contains a number of different elements, which offers itself as a new settlement. I think the question, however, that starts to hove into view is an even more radical question, which is, would you even have pensions? I mean, in 20 or 30 years, will we have a pension system at all? Or will we have a much more kind of flexible lifetime saving system? And, that I think, so, if I was running, we don't kind of do this kind of work at the RSA now. I mean, the work that David P. Watson's been doing we're very supportive, and it's great work, but it's not very RSA-ish, because the RSA is much more kind of interested in change on the ground rather than simply changing policies. But if I was in IPPR now thinking about pensions work, that's where I'd be starting from. I'd be saying, look, you wouldn't have something called pensions. You wouldn't create it now. Not as more and more people work later and later in life, and there's more and more flexible ways of working. You would be thinking about how it is you enable people to save in a flexible way throughout life, and you would be bringing into that thinking about housing and all sorts of other. You'd be having a general conversation about savings and capital and assets, and including pensions in that conversation. That's where think tanks and others need to be kind of doing that work, because such a package would rely on all sorts of things aligning. Probably you would need to have a package like that. You'd need to have money to throw at it. You'd need to have political consent, and who knows when we'll get back to that kind of world. But one day we will, and think tanks should be doing the work now to start to open that up.
One of the key kind of contributions to Turner's thinking was the sort of emergence of behavioural economics, nudge theory, auto-enrolment. One of the arguments against the pension freedom reforms and against a more liberal approach of the kind you've just sketched for lifetime asset accumulation and decumulation is that people are not rational about their long-term needs, and that if you give them more freedoms to draw down on their pension resources, they'll just go and blow those. I wonder what you might think about that.
Yeah, but I don't think you should underestimate auto enrolment as a policy innovation, and I think that if you were thinking about a much more flexible approach to lifetime savings and assets, you would design it in a way which addressed these kind of critical issues of how you get the right balance between paternalism and freedom, how you address the issue of those people who have not only have no savings, but in a sense have no reason to want to save, given the likelihood of them being able to accumulate assets of any kind of proportion. So, I think that you would, and without drifting off the subject, I think this is a classic example of the kind of area where we need new forms of democratic engagement. Whether or not we will ever have a government that has sufficient legitimacy through the systems we now have of decision-making, representative democracy, to do something as bold as this, I think is a very big question. So, if I was again going back and commissioning a major piece of research about a completely different approach to lifetime savings and assets, I would assume that having done some interesting work and developed some scenarios, the next thing you do is pretty deep public engagement, because building up legitimacy for such a package, would be the work of several years, I would have thought. But I don't think it's beyond our capacity to do it. But that's what you learn from Adair. You have to think about the sequencing of the argument. What are the things that you need to establish as first principles? And then once people have agreed to those first principles and signed up to them, you then have to say, well, look, the implication of that is this. And then it's easier. You have to do that step by step.
You mentioned thinking of Adair Turner as a kind of policy entrepreneur. How would you characterise a policy entrepreneur? What do you think the kind of key elements of a policy entrepreneur are?
I think there's only one element, and that is that you are as interested in change as you're interested in making changes being right. I think the term is well chosen. Entrepreneurs don't really care what it is they produce. What they want to do is to have a successful business, and in a sense, policy entrepreneurs, what interests them is making a difference, making an impact. And of course, they've got value base. You're not going to just randomly supporting anything, but you're just much more interested in what you have to do to make change happen than simply producing a report that shows that you're right and the government is wrong. And I think that the argument for that has grown and grown and grown. We live in a world now which has a surfeit of content and deficit of change. So that's the mindset of a policy entrepreneur.
You said that both kind of quite big change is possible, transformative change, as well as incremental, that actually a policy entrepreneur is not to be judged at the kind of scale of change so much as trying to achieve change and understanding how it might happen.
Yeah, so as you know, these are things which the RSA, I've written about here and talk about here a lot, and we have this phrase, think like a system, act like an entrepreneur, which is an attempt to say, look, good policy does have a kind of system lens, that policies that try to shift single variables in systems often don't achieve what they're supposed to achieve or can be counterproductive. So have a system lens, but then have a highly kind of adaptive approach to that. I mean, funnily enough, I interviewed Roberto Unger this week, which is an interesting experience. And of course, I mean, I derived this from Unger, actually. This is one of Unger's kind of greatest hits, is, you know, you have to become a massive vision of the future utopia, but you have a highly kind of agile and experimental way of going about it. So, you know, we have that. And one of the things I sometimes say to people is, look, traditional policymakers ask, what is the change we want to achieve? Policy entrepreneurs say, where is change imminent? Let's look at this system and see where the opportunities for change might arrive. And then when you spot those, then you think, okay, well, given that possibility exists, what could we do in that space to start to open things up, shift things? So yeah, all of that, but then finally, I think I would also say you've just got to be willing to be pretty kind of ruthless. Ruthless isn't the right word. You've got to be, how can I put this? Because I don't really sound like it's self-serving. You've got to take responsibility for it, really. I mean, you know, in the employment review, I think in the first week I was offered the services of the Bayes press office. You know, and that might sound like a trivial thing, but it's not a trivial thing at all. You know, if you rely on Whitehall press office to be the the body that wins legitimacy for what you're trying to do and communicates and engages the media, you will get no coverage at all. You'll be treated with a complete cynicism, and you won't have much control of what comes out at the end of the process. Whereas I did all my own media management. I gave a continuous stream of stories to the press so that it kept in the public eye. So there was no possibility of it. But, you know, by the time we got to the final report, you know, quite a lot of people knew it was happening, and it would have been very, very difficult and embarrassing for the government to sweep it under the carpet. So, you know, in terms of the kind of approach to government and to policy, very pragmatic. From the outset, saying to government, I want to produce a report that you can support. I want to go as far as I can, produce a report. And if there are areas where you don't agree, I won't make them concrete recommendations. I'll make them more broad commentary, like the self-employment stuff that we've just been talking about. But combined with a complete unwillingness to abide by the rules in terms of communication. You know, I was out there winning legitimacy for it throughout, and you know, it you know, and you know, that's kind of, if you do that kind of stuff, it's, you know, it can be nerve-wracking, actually. I mean, I remember when we worked on the Children's Trust Fund, that you and Gavin getting very, very angry with me because I briefed the press around that, because you were squirreling away in Whitehall. But, you know, my view was, you had to get a bit of interest going there, and I was quite happy for you to be angry with me, and it wasn't your job to do that, but it was my job to make sure there was a growing public enthusiasm for this at the same time as you were doing the policy work. And, you know, that's the way that I do this. You know, it opens you up to the accusation that you're ill-disciplined, or even worse, that you're narcissistic and all you really care about is drawing attention to yourself. But I think that winning public legitimacy, keeping the media excited and interested, demonstrating your independence, you know, that's all part of it. And that is what I learned from Adair. Adair had the trust of the media. Nobody thought that Adair's job was to simply be given a report by a bunch of civil servants and put his name on it. He had absolute credibility. And, you know, what I did was of a smaller scale, but I wanted to establish a similar credibility.